closer to love? How you eliminate all your sadness when you opening up? How you make excuses for billionaires you broken up us?
Everybody, thank you so much for joining. We're going to get started now, but feel free to continue introducing yourselves in the chat with your name, your organization, and what region you're calling us from. And just as like a quick orientation to the call today, we're going to ask that folks like stay muted out of respect for our presenters and speakers, but please feel free to use the chat like if you have any comments or questions. We're hoping to have a little bit of time at the end for a bit of Q&A. So if you want to send your questions ahead of time, feel free to do so. But my name is Sarah, and I'm going to be one of your presenters today. I'm with Anti-Imperialist Action at UMBC, and also the International League of People's Struggle, Baltimore DMV Regional Formation. And the ILPS is a global alliance of organizations who are all carrying out their own anti-imperialist and democratic struggles. But our role as an alliance is really to coordinate these, to fight for the concerns and the interests of people across like a range of different causes, whether it's national liberation or economic development or the rights of youth or women, the working class, and other oppressed and exploited people to organize themselves and to live, not just live, but to live well under the system. And this work is really critical right now, right? Since we're living in like a global crisis, whether it's a housing crisis, a migration crisis, an economic crisis, an environmental crisis, like I could really go on. It's nuts that, every day we could like turn on the TV or just go on our phones and witness like historical events playing out. And, we don't really want to like sugarcoat things, but be honest about the situation that we're in and that things are really dire right now. But this is why the ILPS is, really calling for us to build a genuine people's movement as a force that can change history for the better and really fight for the interest in, genuine liberation of the people. So during this webinar, we're going to be discussing just that, like the state of global crisis, but also what people are doing to struggle for freedom, to struggle for better conditions. So we'll be discussing like current events and issues globally and in the context of the US elections, but also make time to highlight the struggles that people are waging on the ground to address these problems. And I think it's really important. We'll draw this out throughout the webinar, but each of these struggles by exposing our common enemies of imperialism and capitalism really like unite people to strike concrete and coordinated blows against it, weakening it, and ultimately like building a mass movement that can really like resolve the root problems of these different issues that we're facing. So just to walk us through like the agenda for today, the first thing that we'll talk about is the People's Platform, which Daniel will introduce us to. And then we'll also have another ILPS member talking to us about the state of imperialism today and these global economic and military agreements. Then we'll talk a little bit about the international situation and feature Andan from BAYAN, Duna from NoDutDol, and Bicho from JUPI before talking about the economy, where we'll have Glenn, rank and file member of Unite Here Local 2, speak to us a little bit today. And then we'll also discuss housing, featuring a speaker for Housing for Juanita, before discussing issues of the environment, the education, and safety, where we'll patch it off to Alan from the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, before ending with a call to action. So I'll first pass it off to our first speaker, Daniel, who'll take us a little bit through the People's Platform.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Daniel here with ILPS US. Happy to be here with y'all. Good to see so many folks out from across the country. Yeah, today we're gonna, as Sarah laid it out, we're gonna talk a lot about a variety of different issues. We're gonna talk about environment, foreign policy, education, the economy. And we all know there are major problems with all of these issues, right? We see the crises every day. And these are all kind of taking place in the context of the US elections right now. And we know that the problems that we're seeing, neither the Democrats or Republicans can or really want to solve, because they don't stand for the people. They are representing an elite group of people, and they're going to govern accordingly, right? Trump's fascist rhetoric is, it's quite scary, right? His vision for the US is bleak. But we also see that Harris is only going to offer a friendlier face to this war machine. She herself represents the genocide in Palestine right now. She represents the mass exploitation of workers in the US across the world that the Biden-Harris administration is carrying out. She represents the repression of the people fighting for change. And, she wants us to believe she has a solution. Even Trump's platform has some rhetoric that's tinged with pro-worker sentiments, right? Pro-worker language. But we know that from history, these pro-people, fake promises, they just don't hold up. They haven't led to fundamental systemic change, which is exactly what we need to actually overcome these problems. A lot of times, when politicians are offering us these promises, it's just meant to confuse, to convince people that voting is the only means to make change, that this incremental, like one step forward, but ultimately two steps back is all we'll ever get. And to prevent people from fighting and dismantling the system itself. So today, on this webinar, we're not here to convince you who to vote for. We're all going to be learning together about how to fight for real change, right? Because that's what it takes to win systemic change is the fight. So the International League of People's Struggle, ILPS US, has developed a real alternative to the vision that the Democrats and the Republicans are putting forward. And we call it the People's Platform. This platform represents all of our aspirations for a better world. It includes what we want to see in everything from civil, political rights, environmental justice, housing, peace and justice, and more. And so we can share the full version of it in the chat with folks if you want to read more. But it's not just about um, the words on the screen. It's not just about this vision. It's about what each of these points represents. It's all of the people rising up in struggle and building a mass movement to address the issues along these lines. So wanted to really uplift people's struggle in this as the means forward, as the way forward. And we're going to share a bit of a political situationer structured around several of these issues. Not all of them. We've selected a couple to highlight. And most importantly, highlight people's struggle in the midst of the global crisis. So with that, I'll pass it off to Nusha to give us a bit of an overview of how we can understand kind of the current global system. And from that, we'll move into some of these more concrete, discrete issues. Yeah, Nusha?
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to ask one of the other folks with host capability to just be admitting people as they're joining for this part. But hi, everyone. My name is Niyusha. I am a member of the International League of People's Struggle, US country chapter. And so, yeah, I'm going to kind of talk briefly about a bit of framing to contextualize the rest of the discussion for today. So as Daniel mentioned, right, we have as one component of what we're discussing today, the People's Platform, right? And the People's Platform is sort of a consolidated expression, as Daniel mentioned, of the most pressing issues facing the people today. And also, more importantly, what people are fighting for and fighting to make a reality. And, the question is, though, what is the system at the root of all of these issues? What is responsible for producing the many issues that we'll be discussing today? And so we want to unite a little bit on a common understanding, at least in the general. And so for us, as an alliance, the root of all of these issues is imperialism. And so the question is, what do we mean by imperialism? So broadly speaking, I don't want folks to get too caught up in the formal definitions. They're here to be useful, but most importantly is really having a general understanding of what these mean. So for us, imperialism can be understood as a development of capitalism. And in particular, it was a period, it arose as capitalism developed. And we saw a few particular features unique to this stage of capitalism. So in the early period of capitalism, of industrial capitalism, there was sort of this type of free market competition. But what's very key about capitalism in sort of the way that it operates, the goal, if you're a capitalist, is to accumulate as much wealth as possible. And that is done by maximizing how much profit you can make. And so one of the key parts of capitalism is there's this sort of drive for consolidating more and more of the productive capacity, more and more capital into the hands of fewer and fewer people, and striving to have more and more control over the economy. And so if you follow that trend, you start to see some developments that turn into imperialism. So number one, you see this trend of the further and further concentration and centralization of capital and production into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And so as that's happening, that is what results in the rise of monopolies. In essence, these very few firms and increasing and decreasing number of firms having more and more control and more ownership of production, and becoming increasingly powerful and influential within the economy. So the rise of monopolies, that's one of the biggest things. And that's why imperialism is often also described as the monopoly stage of capitalism. It's the end of the quote unquote free market capitalism era and the rise of monopolies. On the other hand, aside from more and more being concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer, you also have what was previously separate industrial and banking capital become merged and owned by the same firms, the same people. And so essentially the people who control the banks and the people who control industry become one and the same. And that results in the rise of what we call finance capital and the financial oligarchy, which is this small minority of people who sit at the top of the global class hierarchy. They're the most powerful at the top of it, the monopoly capitalists and the financial oligarchy. So those are two key things, this sort of process of concentration. And then you start to see this rise of the export of capital itself, which is not the same as the way sort of other types of commodities have been circulated. And so increasingly, this export of capital plays a very central role in the world economy. And it comes in many different forms, including quote unquote aids or loans, different types of investment, sort of development projects, for example, or development projects, and so on. And so that becomes an increasingly dominant part of the world economy. And then one of the really big things that I think a lot of people are familiar with is that there is the economic division of the world. So remember, the drive of capitalism, which continues and in fact becomes more heightened in the era of imperialism, is to have more and more control in order to more and more control of the economy in order to maximize profit. And so you have the situation where now these major monopolies are expanding beyond even single national economies and are expanding throughout the world. They need to continue to expand in order to have access to new markets, access to new sources of labor that are cheaper, access to resources to plunder, and access for places to dump the surplus to continue to maximize their profit. And so, so the various monopoly capitalists are no longer confined to a single national industry, but are aiming to divide up the world among major spheres of economic influence and control. And so the different multinational corporations are competing for the economic control. And as we'll talk about in a second, this comes in many different forms and many different expressions of it. And then coupled with this, paired with this economic division, are the fights between the monopoly capitalists for controls of political and territorial spheres of influence and control. So again, they need access to these new markets, access to labor, access to the resources. And so they want control over the places where these things are, right? And so they leverage the various resources that they have. They leverage the capacity of the states that serve the interests of the monopoly capitalists and the militaries under their control and influence to compete for political and territorial control. And as will become relevant when we talk later, we have an understanding that in the efforts to divide up the world, because of the development of imperialism, where the world is already currently divided up, in order to redivide up the world, the imperialist powers are prone, therefore, to resort to war. And war as an expression of a way that the ruling class resolves the problem of needing to fight over control of the market, of territory, and of the economy. So that kind of transitions us, right? And that kind of gives us the general framework by which we can understand things. And so I'll give a brief thing before passing on about what that means for the general layout of imperialism today. But I want to link it back briefly before we move on to why we're going about this first before we talk about the various issues we talk about. So there's a few key things that are the main takeaways I want people to have in kind of discussing this. So number one, remember that drive of capitalism to expand and imperialism to continuously expand, right? And concentrate more and more into the hands of fewer and fewer people. Because of that process of concentrating more and more into the hands of fewer and fewer people in terms of the accumulation of that wealth, about the fact that the world economy is increasingly integrated and global and has all of these different moving parts, and it's actually a social undertaking, a collective undertaking to produce this value. You have this tension between the way that value is generated and the way that it is accumulated, right? And because of the relationship of capitalism, that inherent structure of how it operates, even in the era of imperialism, where it's become more extreme, capitalism is prone to crisis. That crisis comes in the form of economic crisis and political crisis, which is at the root of the housing issues that we face, the environmental destruction that we face, so on and so forth. So capitalism and imperialism mean crisis. Number two, remember that expansion, that constant drive to control more. But the reality of the situation right now is that since the first two world wars, the world is divided. The world is divided into these spheres of influence. And so the imperialist powers use a number of economic measures to compete with each other, essentially economic war against each other. But also when those means in terms of trade deals and negotiations and agreements are not feasible anymore, especially in a time of crisis, the imperialists resort to war. War as a means of addressing that. And so this constant drive for expansion means that at all times, until we resolve this root issue of the continuation of imperialism, we are always under the risk of further worsening crisis, which only primarily impacts the people. And we are also under the constant threat of world war, which most impacts the people and is only to the benefit of the ruling class who profit off of that war and profit off of and seek to gain from the redivision of the world. And so let's keep in mind these things as we go into the world situation and as we hear from how people are organizing against it. And I forgot to switch slides earlier. But in essence, what this is getting at is the situation of war, the different conditions that we're facing right now are really rooted in the economic motivations. So in the case, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, they serve a particular interest, and that's the interest of this monopoly capitalist class that we mentioned in the beginning. And so right now, if you look at the landscape of the world, we know that the US right now is the #1 world superpower, but because of this system and because of the conditions of crisis, it's starting to feel the decline of its position as the unchallenged superpower. And so all around the world, it is simultaneously maneuvering a series of economic deals, whether in the realm of trade and development, or these different in the realm of trade or development. And so you'll see a lot of these different deals going on right now. If folks remember, we had the No to APEC campaign last year, and one of the major things being pushed forward was IPEF. IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was an effort of the US to assert further economic control over the Asia-Pacific region. You also have the development of different types of economic policies that the US is developing right now, such as in Europe, right, where you see the development of different projects in coordination with the G7. And then you see the development of new things like the India, Middle East, European Union Economic Corridor, which is a way to bridge all of these together. But coupled with this, in order to defend these economic interests, the US is also resorting to ramping up and building up war, in an effort to protect its interests right now. And so that's kind of a bit to intro the world situation. But what I want everyone to keep in mind is all of the issues we'll talk about today are an expression of imperialism. And because of this sort of situation that we just described about how imperialism operates, what we can also understand is how we can combat it. And that's what we'll be learning about today. How do we fight these issues? And most importantly, fight at the root. Because what this means about the current situation is that every single person, whether they are part of a movement opposing US-led war, fighting for the national liberation of their homeland, fighting against the economic crisis, fighting for better wages, fighting around housing, all of these are in fact part of the struggle against the imperialist system. And so the task for us, which I hope will become clear by the end of this webinar, is to bring these various movements together and to unite against a common enemy, which is numerically vastly smaller than our movement, right? And so if we're able to draw in all of the different people and organizations and forces who are fighting around the various issues that we're talking about together and unite them, then we can direct them very squarely and clearly at who is responsible for these issues, which is the ruling class. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Sarah. I'm a bit over time, so I'm going to pass it to Sarah to take us away with the rest of the world situation.
Yeah, thank you, Nisha. That was really great. And I think, one of the really key international issues and that I think is, really clear to all of us, like what it means when we say that like imperialism is ramping up, that we're leading closer and closer to world war, and the type of like danger that shows to the people is the situation of Palestine, and how it's been like a year of literal like inhumane military assault against the people of Palestine. Like we've seen the nonstop bombardment that has wiped out like literal hundreds of families from the Palestinian civil registry and like raised cities. We've witnessed like the targeting of medical providers, of journalists, of children, in the way that the occupation has, tried to place internet and electricity sieges to, stop people from really seeing the truth of what's going on. And this type of violence, I think, really exemplifies it for us. Like the type of danger that, we all will be under, if imperialism continues to face this worsening crisis, and the ruling class, steps up their efforts to try to, coordinate their power. And especially with Palestine, people haven't really just been taking this like lying down, right? Like all over the world, people have been demanding like an end to the violence, but it continues. Like people have said no to genocide, like we've demanded a ceasefire, a complete end to the occupation, an arms embargo, And yet, like the US administration just continues to draw from our money, our hard-earned money, to rely on Israel as their puppet state to do its bidding in the Middle East. And, both Trump and the Republican Party and Kamala and the Democratic Party have really made their intentions clear to continue their support of the Zionist state because it serves their interests, their class and political interests. So they continue to endorse the actions of the Zionist state and uphold like its quote like right to defend itself. And this type of support has allowed it to carry out like a year of really calculated genocide, but also to expand the war in other areas in the region, like to Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and Iraq, through bombings that have assassinated key leaders, damaged like civilian infrastructure in urban areas, and killed hundreds of civilians, all in an attempt to crush people's resistance and expand their domination. So I think that demonstrates to us, right, that the occupation and the imperialist goals don't just stop at the total genocide and land theft of Palestine, but the complete destabilization of the region for control of key resources like oil and natural gas or these trade routes that we talked about a little bit. So it's our responsibility to resist, right? Because the type of violence that the Palestinian people are facing is also felt by oppressed and exploited peoples like all over the world. And ultimately, it will be the Palestinian people themselves who break their own chains of oppression, but we have our own role in supporting them in their fight and striking these calculated blows against imperialism. And one example of this is the Mask Off Marist campaign, which was initiated by the Palestinian youth movement. And yeah, it aims to really like materially hurt the system of imperialism, the war industry, and like cripple the US's support to Israeli-driven genocide. And Maersk is a company that is one of the top suppliers of weapons parts to Israel. So yeah, they have that direct role in materially contributing to genocide against the Palestinian people. Since last October, they've shipped like $300 million worth of weapons parts to Israel. And this also endangers workers in the US who have already like spoken out against the conditions that Maersk is making them face that places their lives in danger. So it's so important for us to like link our struggles in the way that the exploitation of working people across the world is also connected to the really deliberate colonial extermination of the Palestinian people. And again, it's our task to really expose these conditions and this connection and build up people to fight back and take our struggle to a higher level. So there are also some other things that have been happening on the world stage, like in the past year. Like Palestine is one thing that comes to mind, but if there are any other like key events that people can recall happening like in the past year, feel free to share it in chat. But I think like what's really undeniable is that we're living in a world where our basic rights are really under attack. And the militarization of the world is only becoming like more and more intense. But what's also evident is, that the people of the world are fighting back. And so with, a better understanding of imperialism's like impact on the current condition of the world, there are some other examples of intensifying war, but also people's resistance that we want to illustrate. So on the international stage, like one issue that's been emerging that we've already discussed is the intensification of US-led wars and conflict, whether it's through different military deals and aid packages or joint military exercises and propping up of military bases. But in the case of Ukraine, this is a proxy war, and this war might have broken out in 2022, but the conflict begins as far back as 2014, when the US intervened in Ukrainian affairs by installing a government that was friendly to NATO. And this led to 8 years of conflict before Russia launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine once they had requested NATO membership. And NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance that is really led by the US. And it's made up of, over like 30 member states, but it's, another strategy to increase funding to war and to allow the US to maintain a presence, not just within the North Atlantic, but far outside of it. When we're seeing nations in Eastern Europe, like Ukraine and Sweden and Finland, all like applying and joining NATO, very shortly after the outbreak of war, it, is really demonstrating to us the way that it's being used as a tactic and as a force to identify and encircle US's rival of Russia as another competing imperialist force. And so this is why, while like our people in the US have been facing crises and, we're reeling from the economic devastation that was really caused by COVID, like that's why the US was still committing like more than $64 billion like in military assistance to Ukraine. And this is more than Biden's student loan forgiveness program, which I found out by doing this research. So, on one hand, like the US is really relying on Ukraine to carry out this proxy war, to expand NATO and doing what they can to increase membership and increase funding to member states to, increase their military presence in Europe. But on the other hand, we're also seeing that Russia is embarking on their own counteroffensive to defend itself as a regional power and maintain its own former sphere of influence. But, both of these competing like imperialist powers over land and resources have displaced millions of people in Ukraine and cost like thousands of lives. So again, another like similar issue is the direct occupation of other countries through different police and military forces, where countries like the US will rely on local puppet governments to carry out its bidding. So in Haiti, most recently, the UN Security Council reauthorized the deployment of the multinational security support, which is a police force led by Kenya to Haiti until 2025 to, quote, quell gang violence. And this continues a trend of the denial of Haitian sovereignty and popular democracy, and the trend of years of occupation by groups like the US and the UN. And these kinds of claims of combating gang violence only really justify foreign military intervention, and hide how the actual crisis in Haiti is rooted in imperialism, where people are stuck in a perpetual state of poverty and having to like leave the country to find better conditions. And again, we've seen as recently as 2019 with the signing of the Global Fragility Act of 2019, which was signed into law by Donald Trump, the way that both the Republicans and the Democrats are really committed to carrying out their interests to expand imperialism around the world. And so the Global Fragility Act is an example of foreign policy that says that there are like fragile states whose nature of being fragile can undermine US security interests. And, but this is, BS. Like we know that this is just another set of tactics that maintain their goals of global domination. So when they say they want to prevent conflict, to promote stability, or support locally driven political solutions, when they're developing like 10-year plans for different pilot countries, including Haiti, and committing over $1 billion over the next 5 years to combat the fragility of these states, we know that this is just another imperialist tactic that they're using to secure the resources and labor of the people of Haiti for their own. And, this piece of foreign policy also names that they want to advance like national security interests to like manage rival powers. So Russia and China as other key like imperialist nations. And while Trump may have initially signed this act into law, in 2022, the Biden-Harris administration reaffirmed their own commitment to carrying it out by outlining a clear strategy for its implementation. So, rather than spending money to improve conditions domestically, the ruling class is choosing to focus foreign policy and their own financial agenda on expanding their own economic and military power and intervening in other countries, rather than bettering conditions here. And this is not like the type of foreign policy solution that we need, um, but another example of people rising up against, in countries that are oppressed by imperialism, who've had enough and are deciding to resist, are the student protests in Bangladesh that took place earlier this year, where university students took to the streets to demand a reform in the quota system for public service jobs, which would reserve 30% of very limited jobs for children of freedom fighters in the War of Independence. And so, as people who are spending their lives like working hard and sacrificing in different ways to attain higher education in the hopes of, climbing the career or the class ladder, like students have a right to be outraged because they're not receiving like the full benefits of the education that they're really like seeking out. They're not able to, sort of attain the future that's promised to them by making these sorts of sacrifices. But, when we look a little bit further at this problem, like we also see that Bangladesh is a country that's really racked with unemployment and is targeted as a country with a cheap labor pool, which has warped their economic system to export goods and even people to other areas of the world as migrant workers. And so this relationship goes as far back as 1972, when Bangladesh first earned their independence through partnerships like with the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, where the country would be offered these predatory loans, where they would have to reshape their economies in a way that would meet the conditions of these, multinational entities. And so the Bangladesh initially accepted a $50 million emergency recovery credit in the aftermath of the independence. So to build the country back up after devastating war. But since then, the World Bank has committed more than 38 billion. And this is a loan. So it's something that the country, has to pay back. But when your economy is so devastated that, you can't rely on an industry that can provide for your own country, you're going to be kept in a state of just a cycle of debt. And so instead of having like an actual agricultural industry or national economy that can promote the sovereignty of Bangladesh, like people are forced to migrate or work in really backbreaking or inhumane conditions, like in sweatshops and garment factories. So the Bangladeshi students and people deserve better. They deserve to like rise up and resist, like we were seeing with these like quota protests. And so their actions really demonstrate the possibility of coordinated action because they were even able to force the former Prime Minister Hasina to resign. And so in the meantime, an interim government has been put in place, but we can only hope that this is one that can actually genuinely represent the interests of the people and develop the national economy in a way that can really provide for the people of Bangladesh. And then the last example, before I pass it off to our other speakers, is that, again, like people around the world cannot stand to see like the genocide in Palestine play out for another day, and so they're rising up to confront the U.S. Zionist collaboration. And so the people in Yemen are doing that, embracing that struggle in one of the highest forms possible through militant resistance. They have targeted and occupied commerce routes in the Red Sea, quite literally striking blows against the war machine by targeting commercial vessels that are transporting the goods and the arms that, enable the violence to continue. And by damaging the Zionist state, by, striking a blow to imperialism in this way, the Yemeni resistance is also sending a message to the world of what international solidarity looks like, what it looks like when we identify our common enemy and fight back. And so this show of resistance and solidarity should really inspire us in our own fights to be militant in our action, and, analyze our conditions, figure out who our friends and who our enemies are in order to strengthen the movements that we're waging. So to talk a little bit more about this, I'm now going to invite other organizations who are waging their own campaigns against US economic and military intervention and consequences, particularly in the Asia Pacific and the Caribbean. So first we'll hear from Andan. Andan is the national chair of BAYAN USA, an overseas chapter of Bagong Aliansang Makabayan, an alliance of mass organizations across classes and sectors struggling for national sovereignty and genuine democracy in the Philippines. So please give him a warm welcome.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you for that really comprehensive overview of where we are right now in the international situation and domestically too. Apologies, my voice is coming in and out. So I lose my voice, I will go on mute and try to get back. But I'm here to speak about the Philippines. All of the same, evils of our society and problems, crisis that is happening is also impacting the people of the Philippines, both in diaspora here in the United States or as migrants, and also back home. But I'll speak more about the crisis in the Philippines and the people's fight back. Next slide. So the Philippines, not sure how many people know about it. Very beautiful country, very rich country, but there's a saying that we always try to highlight within Bayan, that the Philippines is rich, but the Filipino people are poor. And that contradiction is really essential to understanding what we have to do to fight back, right? Understanding the roots of poverty. If we are from a country that is so rich in resources, in people, right? And so I'd like to share some of those things with a couple of stories now. I think we were able to get a really good overview of the world situation and big trends, right, in militarism and so on, which I'll also speak about for the Philippine case. But I think it's easier to understand if we look at some people. Next slide. The Philippines, oh, I think this maybe needs to be refreshed.
It seems most people can see. Can everyone see the screen? Okay, go ahead, Andan.
Okay. Okay, it's a different slide on my thing, but maybe could you try going to the next one? If not, I'll just do it without the slides. It's chill. Okay. Yeah, if you can keep going back. Okay, sweet. So the Three people are pictured on the screen right now. Their names are Chad Book, Jerain Nguho, and Kian de los Santos. And the reason I bring them up when we're talking about the international situation in the Philippines is that these were three young people who were martyred by the Philippine state, by the Philippine police, and by the Philippine military. Kian de los Santos was on his way home to study for an exam when police took him to an alley, was caught on CCTV, and as he was pleading for his life because he had to study for an exam, they killed him executioner style in the alleyway. That was under the quote-unquote drug war of Rodrigo Duterte, the former Philippine president. Also under his presidency, the two other activists pictured here, Chad and Jerain, who are youth that we know in Bayan that we've worked with, were captured by the Philippine military. They were tortured in ways that I would rather not share today, and then executed as well. Chad and Jerain were two young teachers for indigenous schools in the Philippines who set up schools in places where the Philippine government did not reach with their education, but definitely reached with their bombs and their artillery shelling. And these are just three people out of many who were killed in the drug war and killed in the war against national minorities and people in the countryside in the Philippines. Next slide. We also have someone named Jennifer Laude. Jennifer Laude is a trans woman. She was murdered in cold blood by a US Marine, Joseph Scott Pemberton. The 10-year anniversary of her murder was just earlier this month. And when the US Marine was caught and put on trial, the United States military protected him. They tried to lodge him in different places. They tried to protect him in court, and they did everything they could so that eventually Jennifer's murderer was given a full pardon by, again, Rodrigo Duterte, and is now roaming freely back here in the United States. Next slide. And the reason I'm bringing this up in the context of the international situation is because all of these things are funded, designed, and coordinated with the United States and its imperialist forces, right? The drug war and the war against peasants in the countryside, under Duterte's time, the United States gave about $500 million to fund all those things, despite knowing that those drug wars were killing, upwards of 30,000 people, displacing hundreds of thousands of people through aerial bombings in the countryside that those activists were fighting against, right? And Kian de los Santos wasn't even an activist. He was just trying to get to school on time for the next day, right? Under the current president now, Marcos, there's been renewed military aid to the Philippines. Again, another $500 million, so another $500 million in just this year alone. And that's not even including the number of millions of dollars being put towards new bases in the Philippines, which are unconstitutional in the Philippine Constitution, but the United States has found a way through these different agreements to get those bases back. And so you see a map here on the screen. It's not just the bases, though. There's also the joint training that's happening between the United States. You'll see here in Washington, D.C., in San Diego. There's many other cities, New York, San Francisco, that have all held joint training sessions between the same police force or the same military that is attacking our own people, right? Right now in the Philippines, there's an exercise of Marines, right? And it's over one of 500 military war games being planned between the United States and the Philippines just this year alone, right? And so all these things I'm mentioning, I wanted to start with stories of people who have been martyred by not just the Philippine fascist state, but US imperialism, because this is what those hundreds of millions of dollars go to, those billions of dollars go to, instead of the needs here. Next slide. I also wanted to show that it's not just about the military, like many folks said. These are just screenshots from a press release from the United States and the Philippines earlier this July in what they called a ministerial dialogue between their respective departments of state and departments of defense. You can see here increase in investments in militarism, increase in security assistance, the $500 million I mentioned, maritime cooperation, nuclear trade deals, other economic trade deals, and then trying to justify the territorial dispute between the Philippines and China to justify the United States intervention in our country. And so these are all things that are happening and that have real impacts on the Filipino people. Next slide. But we fight back, right? We have been campaigning for the US to be out of the Philippines for decades now. And what many people don't realize is that in the early 1990s, the two major bases in the Philippines, US bases, Clark Air Base and Subic Naval Base, the largest in the Asia Pacific, the largest of the US's bases in the Asia Pacific, were successfully kicked out because of the People's Movement. It forced the Senate to not ratify the treaty to renew the base agreement again. And so the Filipino people have kicked out foreign aggressors before, the United States bases being one example, Japanese fascist troops during World War II, Spain during our War of Independence at the turn of the 20th century. And we're continuing that legacy today, both, of course, in the Philippines, but including here within the belly of the beast, saying that the Philippines is not for sale, that our youth want money for education, not for war, that we want to pass things like the Philippine Human Rights Act to hold the Philippine state accountable and not to send any more US military aid to these fascist regimes. So I'm definitely over time, but last slide. We do have a campaign, US Out of the Philippines. So if folks would like to help out, support, it's on screen right now, it's also in the chat. But if folks are wanting to learn more about the Philippines, I'm happy to answer any more questions and follow our socials to learn more about the campaign and our anti-imperialist work. Thank you.
Thank you, Andan. Yeah, that was really great and super inspiring, I think, to hear about the way that people are taking up the struggles both in and out of the Philippines. We'll now hear from another speaker, Duna. Duna is an organizer with NoDutDol in the Bay Area, and NoDutDol is an organization of diasporic Koreans and comrades that organize for a world free of imperialism and for Korea's re/unification and national liberation. So take it away, Duna.
Thank you so much. Hello, my name is Duna, and I'm a member of NoDutDol in the San Francisco Bay Area. NoDutDol is an organization of Koreans and comrades fighting for anti-imperialism and national liberation on the Korean Peninsula. And we stand with people's movements around the world fighting for national sovereignty and liberation. We are so honored to have been invited by the International League of People's Struggles to speak about the current situation in Korea and to introduce our campaign, US Out of Korea. Today, Korea is on the brink of another war, and this is entirely the fault of the Biden administration. In 2023 alone, the US conducted war exercises in Korea for 200 days. Earlier this summer, South Korea suspended a 2018 inter-Korean military pact that previously prevented both countries from initiating any hostile acts near the border. The Biden administration has also restarted the war games, with the US and South Korean militaries holding joint nuclear exercises to rehearse a potential nuclear strike on North Korea. With the creation of the Japan-Korea-US Trilateral Alliance, also known as JACUS, the US has even managed to reconcile the governments of South Korea and Japan, Korea's first colonizer, in a brand new trilateral alliance with the US. The situation in Korea right now is the worst that it's been in decades, and we are dangerously close to a hot war on the peninsula. But how did we get here, and how did the situation escalate so sharply? The reality is that this war is not new. Korea has been at war for almost 80 years, since the US imposed an arbitrary dividing line across our peninsula in 1945. Beginning in 1950, the official start of the Korean War, the US used Korea as its stage for the Cold War, dropping over 630,000 tons of bombs and over 32,000 tons of napalm onto Korea, and transforming North Korean cities into ash and rubble in the name of so-called freedom and democracy. After 3 years of brutal fighting and a US-led scorched earth campaign, the war ended not with a peace treaty, but with a ceasefire at the 38th parallel that would temporarily divide Korea into two until a formal peace treaty could be reached. However, this peace treaty has still never been achieved. Since then, the US has functionally established a puppet state in South Korea, a small country only 1/4 the size of California, with over 28,500 US troops and 62 US military bases across the peninsula. This puppet government under President Yoon has continued a path of escalation towards North Korea, such as its illegal flying of drones over North Korean airspace and its ongoing military war games, which include rehearsals of regime change in North Korea. Due to the US's imperialist geopolitical interests in the Asia-Pacific, the impending transition from this new Cold War into a hot war puts our loved ones and the peoples of Asia at enormous risk. As members of the Korean diaspora and as comrades committed to ending US imperialism across the globe, it is our historical responsibility and duty to stop US imperialism from within the belly of the beast. There needs to be a path forward towards peace, self-determination, and justice in Korea, but it is obvious that the current South Korean government and the US empire is not committed to this. As this year's US presidential elections are unfolding, we understand that both parties under Harris and Trump are both sides of the same imperialist coin that cannot and will not resolve the ongoing crisis in Korea. What we really need is a people-led movement against rising imperialist escalation and aggression in the Korean Peninsula. So to respond to this current political moment, NoDutDol has launched our campaign earlier this year, US Out of Korea. Our campaign for US out of Korea includes the following 4 demands. 1. US out of Korea. We demand the full and permanent withdrawal of US troops and weapon systems from Korea. We demand that all Korean land, water, and airspace appropriated for the US military be returned to the Korean people. 2. End the US-South Korea alliance. We demand an end to all US-South Korea alliances, including the JACUS, or Japan-Korea-US Trilateral Security Cooperation. We demand an end to all US-South Korea joint command structures, including the Combined Forces Command, or the CFC, and the UN Command, the UNC. 3. End all aggression against North Korea. We demand an end to all US military exercises in Korea, and we demand all sanctions against North Korea be lifted. And lastly, 4, end the war economy. We demand that the US government divert spending from war, prisons, and policing, and instead, we demand housing, education, healthcare, and climate justice for working people. Through our US Out of Korea campaign, we hope to join the broader struggle to bring an end to US imperialism throughout the world. While working and oppressed peoples struggle to survive in these increasingly uninhabitable conditions, the US is busy driving wars around the world, including in Korea. With the US Out of Korea campaign, we aim to integrate the Korean liberation movement into the broader anti-imperialist front in this country, as well as shift the dominant narratives about the Korean War, the division of Korea, and North Korea. Especially with the most recent genocide in Gaza, we see the tides turning as people across the world bear witness to the barefaced destructiveness of the US and Zionist imperial entities in Palestine. We invite you all to join us in the struggle for national liberation and self-determination in Korea. You can stay connected with our campaign through our Instagram and Twitter at NoDutDol. And if you would like to become a member of NoDutDol or join our mailing list, you can also check out our campaign website at usoutofkorea.org, which is also on the slide. And also, if you're a part of an organization, please endorse our campaign, also at the same website, usoutofkorea.org. Lastly, if you happen to be in the San Francisco Bay Area, on Sunday, November 17th in Oakland, California at the East Side Arts Alliance, NoDutDol Bay Area will be having a film screening and discussion of the documentary North Korea Beyond the DMZ. The flyer and RSVP form for this event will be out soon on our socials and mailing lists. Please keep an eye out on our social media and email list for any other local events if you're based in the Bay Area, Los Angeles, or New York City. Thank you so much. And US out of Korea, US out of the Philippines, and down with US imperialism. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Duna. Yes to people's-led movement and to self-determination. And in that same vein, we'll have another speaker discuss decolonial struggles taking place a little bit closer to home. And so Bicho is the national chair of Juventud Unida por la Independencia, or JUPI. He's based in Brooklyn, and his favorite color is green. And JUPI is a Puerto Rican youth and student organization that organizes towards Puerto Rican independence with a socialist perspective. They do so by organizing and educating in their communities, and are currently doing so through their Puerto Rico con Puerto Ricanos national campaign against displacement of Puerto Ricans, both in the diaspora and in the archipelago. So welcome to Bicho, take it away.
What up, everybody? Shout out to all the Puerto Ricans going crazy in the chat right now. I'm gonna give y'all a little bit of an overview of what's happening in Puerto Rico right now, because it is for us currently a historic moment. So at the same time that the United States is deciding between its red or blue imperialist rulers in this election cycle, Puerto Rico is also undergoing their own elections for governorship. Sorry, 1 second. So Puerto Ricans in the archipelago can't vote for the president of the United States. And Puerto Ricans both in the archipelago and in the diaspora are agitated this year by their local elections in Puerto Rico, because for the first time in history, there's a candidate that does not represent the bipartisan options, that represents independence and has an actual chance of winning. Post Hurricane Maria, Puerto Ricans have been agitated and pissed off by the administration of the Puerto Rican government. And this is because for so long, the two majority parties have contributed directly with their policy and with their corruption to the degradation of the archipelago of Puerto Rico. And the people of Puerto Rico want a change. The statehood party in particular, which has been the statehood party, the people who want Puerto Rico to become a state, they have been in power for many years and has used voter intimidation through threatening public workers' jobs if they don't vote for them. And it has also come out that thousands of ballots of dead people have been used to vote for them in the past elections. 900,000 people in 2016 and 2020 voted in the governorship elections in Puerto Rico that were actually passed away, like they weren't living. There's also the party, this is also the same party that has received the most donations from US-based donors. This election represents that the people are ready for an end to this rampant corruption. And before I explain any further, I just want to emphasize that JUPI isn't endorsing any of the political candidates. Instead, we have chosen to utilize these elections as a tool to understand what are the interests and desires of the Puerto Rican people so that we can better organize for those needs. So we've hosted debate watch parties. We've had debate debrief events where we talk through the issues brought up by the candidates and compared it to what the people really want. And these events have allowed us to raise people's consciousness around the root of our problems, which is US imperialism, and connect the dots on how the different austerity measures placed on us by the US in turn degrades our quality of life. Through our events, we have learned that Puerto Ricans, especially young ones, feel neglected by the Puerto Rican and US governments. They have expressed many desires for the archipelago, such as an end to corruption to Puerto Rican politics. They want Puerto Rico's energy system to be a public resource rather than privatized like it currently is. Luma and NAARPR, which are the private companies that control the Puerto Rico's electricity generation and disbursement, has averaged about 38,000 outages since July 10th when we started collecting the data. Right now, if you go to the Luma website, you will see that there's 14,000 outages in the archipelago of Puerto Rico right now. They also want the school system to be properly funded. This year has been the hottest on record in Puerto Rico, and public schools still don't have air conditioning and they have poor infrastructure. Many schools have been closed, and the University of Puerto Rico currently has a debt of $107 million. They want the revival of our towns in Puerto Rico. From 2010 to 2020, 28% of the youth population have left Puerto Rico, leaving many places in the archipelago looking emptier and emptier. Imagine all these people leaving and what the towns look like afterward when there's not as much of a population. And finally, what we've learned is that they want mental health services. Puerto Ricans, both in Puerto Rico and the diaspora, have 20%, 27% higher rates of depression than the general US population. The topic of status has also come up several times throughout this election cycle from the candidates and from the masses. Puerto Rico has been a colony of the US for 126 years, and our political status in relation to the United States has been debated for decades. Juan Dalmau, which is the person I mentioned earlier that is making this election historic, he represents the Independence Party, and many youth are voting for him. He has proposed a process for decolonization in Puerto Rico in which the Puerto Rican people can choose between independence, statehood, and free association, which is the status that Puerto Rico currently is. This proposal outlined by Dalmau is nothing different from the referendums that we've had in the past. And in fact, it also isn't different from what AOC, Nidia Velasquez have proposed with their Status Act bill. Juan Dalmau, even though he's the anti-corruption candidate, is not promising anything new when it comes to determining the status. He uses buzzwords like decolonization when in actuality, his political measures will reinforce Puerto Rico's colonial relationship with the United States. The root of the problem is colonialism, and the Puerto Rican people believe that a lack of sovereignty and dignity is one of the biggest issues in the archipelago. We have also learned from the masses during these elections that there is a need for JUPI's Puerto Rico with Puerto Ricans national campaign against displacement. A recent survey revealed that 53% of Puerto Ricans are ready to leave the archipelago in order to have a better future. And we have to ask, how do we get to this point? La Junta de Control Fiscal, which was put in place under President Obama, is a board of officials who are unelected but are appointed by the United States to decide on every economic decision that Puerto Rico makes in order to resolve a $73 billion debt. To achieve this goal, they have gutted our education and healthcare systems, robbed our pensions, encouraged foreign investment by incentivizing foreigners to buy up property in Puerto Rico, and they privatized our electric system. These neoliberal measures have forced our people to leave Puerto Rico, and it is at the point that the diaspora population is almost double that of the archipelago. Those who move to the U.S. also face displacement again, as 33.3% of Puerto Rican homeowners and 56.2% of Puerto Rican renters in the U.S. experience cost burden, which means you're paying more than 30% of your income on housing. Through this campaign, we have mobilized actions in response to massive power outages caused by Luma. We've hosted educational teach-ins on our Puerto Rican history. We've had vigils to commemorate the victims of Hurricane Maria. And we're also anticipating a response by the people if Juan Dalmau doesn't win and instead the status quo candidates win. And we're preparing to be with the masses in the ways that they want to respond. I want to close by addressing the Puerto Rican people. I think historically we've had a lot of militancy and a lot of fight within us. And I'm proud to see that a lot of us are wanting to make a change and are doing what we can to make a change because we know that Puerto Rico is being taken away from us every day. We've also historically faced many difficulties within our movement and within our community that has hindered the mass movement in general. I think it's time to be united, We've had a lot of disunity in our movement. We got to be united in this time. And I think we have so much to learn from our allies in the rest of the world who not only are doing amazing work to liberate their own people, but are also rooting for Puerto Rico to be free. So my message to the Puerto Ricans is to let's live up to those dreams. Que viva Puerto Rico libre y socialista. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bicho. Lots of love for Hoopy and Bicho in the chat. Yeah, really important work that you all are doing to, raise people's consciousness and education about these issues, and expose the way that colonialism has, degraded the quality of life and made it so people have to leave to find better conditions. So thank you all for our first round of speakers. It was really inspiring to hear about these campaigns and the resistance both in and out of these countries. And now as we move into talking about, issues facing us like domestically. I'll pass it off to our first presenter, Jasper, to discuss the issue of the economy and also worker struggles.
Hey, thank you so much. Hey everyone, I'm Jasper from the ILPS Baltimore and DMV Regional Formation. Thank you to all of our speakers so far for taking us through the current situation of intensifying crisis and growing resistance around the world. Though the different like forms of exploitation and forms of resistance might look different, the whole of our society is really tied to the interests of the imperialist elite, whether you're living in imperialist countries like the US or the nations that they are dominating and exploiting. So we really are living under this society where these giant corporations and investors have like carved up the whole world so they can make like trillions of dollars off the hard work of the people, but they're selling back to us like the same products and services that we help create. So this leads to a huge crisis that we can see here in the US where people can't afford to buy all of these products. The products themselves are being created to earn record profits for these companies and not actually plan to meet people's needs. So as you can see from that little graph with the orange bars, the basic prices of basic products have increased by 21%. But of course, like the federal minimum wage over that time period, and even for the past 15 years, has been the same. It's been 725. So we see that prices are rising, but it's not matching up with the pace of wages rising. So where is all of that money going if it's not actually going to the workers? So just as a little example, unless you're vegan, you probably saw the price of eggs triple in the last 4 years. But the wages of the farm workers who are all actually taking care of those chickens and packing those eggs went up less than 20% in the same time period. So yeah, exactly. Like, so they can buy like what, 2 or 4 cartons of eggs with the amount that they make in an hour. But of course, we have to spend so much more on the society than just like eggs. Like we have to pay for actual housing and education and healthcare, things that should be provided by or provided for us. But you see that these corporations are really driving to squeeze as much profit out of people as possible, which creates this huge crisis where the wages that they're paying people is not enough to cover all the costs of the products and services that they're trying to sell. So, back in the 70s, to try and save the bottom line of the corporations that they're serving, the US government started these policies of neoliberalism. So they started deregulating industries like, airlines and cracking down on protections for workers organizing, privatizing public services like electricity and healthcare, so that, corporations can jack up the prices. I mean, yeah, I went to the emergency room because I got injured and it was just $250 to sit in the waiting room for like literally nothing. Like I didn't get the services. So like, we see that there is also a bunch of trade liberalization, right? Corporations are there's been this huge decline in US manufacturing industries and across so many different like industries and workplaces, whether it's like the grocery stores to like docks and ports. These corporations are using more and more technology and automation. Uh, I guess like, yeah, put it in the chat if y'all have gotten yelled at by one of the little like automated self-checkout things before. This isn't like innately a bad thing, right? Technology. In theory, these could make workers' jobs easier, but since our economy is set up to make the maximum profit off the labor of the workers, instead of giving people a break, the workers are treated as disposable, right? So we know that increasing automation and technology will lead to massive layoffs and hour cuts. So recently we saw the longshoremen with the International Longshoremen's Association all across the East Coast were fighting back against this increasing automation. So they were striking not only for higher wages, but for an end to the automation and for actual job security, as this is threatening to put them out of work. We also see that Boeing workers are continuing this struggle for economic security. For over 5 weeks now, they've been on strike because the company is refusing to give workers pensions. And they're claiming like it's no longer financially viable. But we're told, and this is what the company's telling the Boeing workers, that our whole lives we have to work to make this society function. But then, when we can't work anymore, when we're too old, it's our responsibility as individuals to take care of ourselves, not the companies that we earn these record profits for, not the government who we're producing all of this value for, but ourselves. And we're told that that's something that we should accept. But this is really not the system that we want or the system that we deserve. Um, and during the start of the COVID pandemic, when so many of us were laid off, we got those like 1 or 2 time checks, right? But in the meantime, the largest corporations like Boeing and Marriott got these huge loans from the government while they were like actively firing workers. So, since all of these layoffs, many people are now working multiple jobs, like these gig work type of jobs and contract positions that you can get fired from at any time. And the Biden administration is proud of this. They're trying to say that they're pro-worker because they're creating like 15 million new jobs, but mostly all of these are these part-time positions without actual benefits. So you'd need like 2 or 3 of them to cover your monthly expenses. And in the meantime, we've seen the number of right to work states or states that prohibit union membership as a condition of employment. They've risen to over 28. So instead of actually addressing these basic concerns of the people, instead of actually instituting protections for workers organizing and job security, the government is listening to the union busting lobbyists that have spent over $430 million a year to keep government officials in the loop, to implement all of these anti-worker laws on their behalf. So it's really like painfully clear that the US government's priorities are literally just to ensure that these corporations' profits continue to grow. And any band-aid solution, whether it's those like COVID checks or making like a couple more part-time jobs, these like false solutions that they try and present the working class is just an attempt to dampen the fighting spirit of the people who actually have the potential to end this system of exploitation. So right now, it's really crucial for the workers themselves to actually take this struggle into their own hands. So next, we're going to hear from a member of Unite Here, which is one of the unions, or yeah, the union leading the struggle of over 300,000 workers, including the recent hotel worker strike. So we'll hear from Glenn Mercado, who's a rank and file member of Unite Here Local 2, as well as a member of Malaya Movement San Francisco's Prop and Communications Committee, which is advocating for human rights, genuine democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines. So I'll pass it over to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Jasper. So Unite Here is an international labor union representing approximately 300,000 workers across the so-called US and Canada. Its membership is predominantly composed of workers in the hotel, casino, food service, manufacturing, textile, distribution, laundry, transportation, and airport industries. As a rank and file member of Local 2, which is an affiliate of Unite Here, I've dedicated 19 years of service to the hotel industry in the city, settled on the ancestral homeland of the Yelamu people, San Francisco. In 2018, I became one of over 7,700 workers who waged a strike against the Marriott for a fair contract. This experience set the trajectory of my life's journey toward the struggle I waged together with y'all today. The level of agitation, unity, and most critically, the consistent support of grassroots community organizers helped me recognize my agency, as well as the responsibility I have to my people and the future of humanity. So I salute my comrades who, under the banner of Migrante, fostered the early stages of my development as a political activist. Now, fast forward, and we are back on the picket lines after months of unresolved negotiations leading up to contract expirations. This time, we're taking on a number of hotel operators, as well as these quote unquote shadow bosses driving job cuts. Although strikes are actively ongoing in multiple cities, such as Honolulu and Boston, my sharing onward will primarily focus on San Francisco. Currently, Over 2,000 hotel workers in San Francisco are on strike. Local 2 staff members last described negotiations between the union and hotel operators as quote unquote far apart. Initially, our proposal included a $10 raise within a 4-year contract, a term that would synchronize with other cities in order for us to consolidate power. We want to secure health benefits, a raise in our pension, fair staffing, fair workloads, no cross classification, which I'll get into shortly, and even some oversight of any implementation of automation or new technology that may negatively impact us. We have more demands in addition to these. However, I believe that these were identified to be of most concern to the overall membership. Now, let me tell you about the counteroffer, dubbed the worst we've ever received. A $1 raise, which was explained would be in a quote unquote bucket, meaning that that single dollar would be split between our wages and our benefits. They want to eliminate our retiree medical benefits. They want us to cover any increases made toward our health coverage. They want unlimited cross classification, meaning workers can be tasked with responsibilities outside the scope of their job classification, which means greater workloads and more cuts to staffing in other departments. This would also allow management to step in and perform our duties as they see fit, which leads to those same issues. Meanwhile, the hotel industry is actually raking in massive profits, even outperforming pre-pandemic levels. For example, in 2023, Marriott International's net income amounted to $3.08 billion, more than doubling its reported $1.27 billion in 2019. And this picture is incomplete. Host Hotels and Resorts is a large investment firm that takes up ownership of hotel properties. And last year, their total revenue amounted to $5.31 billion. This firm, or real estate investment trust, owns properties where the Marriott Marquis and the Grand Hyatt operate in San Francisco. And a little side note, Vanguard and BlackRock are its top institutional shareholders. Yeah. Anyhow, the hotel operators' refusal to bargain in good faith is clear. What they propose would even undo what we've already fought for and won. So our campaign calls are responding appropriately. You know, respect our work. One job should be enough, and make them pay. And you'll catch these in our picket lines on our placards, through our bullhorns and media coverage. Where I'm employed, workers are currently on standby. So I've been hitting the picket lines at other hotels alongside my Malaya Movement family and Solidarity allies, building contacts and learning more about the workers and their issues. We're working closely with the local 2 staff, supporting their initiatives, such as distributing posters to local businesses who want to show their support, preparing our membership to adopt a picket line, participating in their community leaders meetings for updates and to brainstorm tactics, delivering words of solidarity on the picket lines to uplift the workers while making the connections to our advocacy for human rights in the Philippines. We must continue to propagate the interconnections of our struggles, how migrants who make up most of the workforce are coerced into cheap labor as they escape the socioeconomic instability they experience in their homelands, often due to imperialist or colonial projects, meddling, or aggression. So to take up the hotel workers' struggle for a fair contract is to deliver a blow to this cycle of violence being perpetrated in the name of endless profit for a few. Workers' rights are human rights. So power to the hotel workers' strike and power to the working class. Thanks.
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, that was really great. Yeah, a $1 wage increase is insane. And yeah, I think power to you all in your fight for better working conditions, and really inspiring in the fight for the right of working class and exploited peoples everywhere. So now I'm going to pass it back to Daniel to walk us through like the next issue of housing.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Glenn, for those sharings. Yeah, let's not forget, despite all of the anti-worker rhetoric that Trump is touting, that it was Joe Biden's administration that uh, cracked down aggressively on the railroad workers' strike just a while ago, denying them of their right to justice and fair working conditions. So we know that neither of these presidents stand for the people, neither of these options. And so it's so inspiring to hear from folks like, yeah, how we can fight back. Yeah, with that, I wanted to transition a little bit into talking about the housing system in this country. Can folks share just like, who here has experienced, you know, some major issue with housing, whether it's been affordability, whether it's been living with roommates, these kinds of things. Just share in the chat, like, for whom is housing an issue here in the US? I know, like, for me personally, I've had to move, places have been unaffordable. Within Seattle, one of the most expensive cities in the entire country. And things are only getting more expensive. Um, there's yeah, a massive crisis in affordable housing here in the US. And yeah, ultimately, we know that this is a problem of um, the fact that the housing system here is not uh, built for um, the people. It's not intended to actually be used for housing. The housing in this country has been completely commodified, right? It is being used as a way to manage wealth, to generate money for profits. And so, we see the impacts everywhere, right? There are massive increases in the price of housing, whether it's for renters or for homeowners. Over 11 million people in the entire country are rent burdened, severely rent burdened. It means that they pay more than half of their income on housing, which is not acceptable in a country where everything else is so expensive, right? Housing is such a major expense, and it also means that the rest of living becomes more unaffordable as well. Um, and so, of course, there is a crisis of, a lack of housing, lack of unaffordable housing, but the solutions that are being offered by the Democrats and the Republicans do not get at the root of the issue, right? Zoning, changes in the zoning laws, um, building smaller houses, these are things that are not going to actually fix the crisis of housing in this country, right? Especially not these fascist solutions that the Supreme Court is advancing right now, that just ruled this past summer, that, to make it easier, essentially, for cities to criminalize housing and or criminalize homelessness, right? And so, in the wake of this ruling, we've seen cities ramping up their efforts to sweep people, right, is what it's called, remove folks from where they are living because, housing has been such an issue. Lack of stable housing is so unaffordable. And people are being swept and moved around all over the place. Folks were being bussed out of California into other cities as, the so-called solution to this problem. We can only expect more of these problems in the build-up to the World Cup that will be hosted in the US in 2026. That, as we've seen from history, people will continue to be swept. There will be heightened militarization across the country as the world or as the US prepares to be on this global stage. So the crisis is really dire, right? It's very severe. And meanwhile, large investment corporations are scooping up housing. There's a statistic, I believe, that by 2030, 40% of single-family homes may be owned by large investment corporations. So we're heading in a bad direction there. But of course, it is the people's resistance that really matters, that can decisively help address the root causes. And so, you know, the image here on the left is folks that were able to buy back their building from their landlord in Minneapolis through organizing, through coming together and establishing kind of collective ownership over their own homes. And that's just one example of the struggle for housing that we're seeing across the country as people recognize it as a right. And so with that, I wanted to pass it over to Jason from Housing for Juanita to share a little bit about the struggle there. Jason is a Filipino migrant who has lived in Los Angeles, California for the last 30 years. And he became a leader through the Housing for Justice or Housing for Juanita campaign, which began in October 2023 and sought to demand better services and more humane treatment for participants of LA Mayor's Karen Bass's Inside Safe program. And over the course of a year, the residents gained the support of several hundred people across Southern California, 30 plus community organizations and press coverage, and ultimately organized and won their fight to be housed. Now, Jason is a member of Migrante LA, a grassroots organization fighting for the rights and welfare of Filipinos abroad and genuine democracy and sovereignty in the Philippines. So passing it over to Jason. Thanks for being here. And Jason, if you're trying to speak, you're still muted at the moment.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Hi, Jason. Yep, we can hear you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm kind of nervous. So, my name is Jason, and I'm one of the leaders in the Housing for Juanita campaign. And now, as you said, I'm a member of Migrante Los Angeles. We started a campaign called Housing for Juanita, January, and we were assisted by other organization like Gabriela. By the time we had been 3 months into Los Angeles government program called Inside Safe, meant to provide a pathway to housing for people experiencing homelessness. There was around 80 of us swept into the motel, and about 20 of us were Filipino migrants previously living on a street called Juanita. Here's a video about our story.
Relocated from the Juanita encampment, the program promises have not been met and we feel less safe inside. We're tired of empty promises. One day, some people came and told me they would give me my own place. So I agreed, take me away from the rats. They took us to the motel, and when I got there, I felt empty.
In the program, I developed a severe form of depression because I was isolated from my community and could not access mental health services. I ended up having to lock myself in my room for over a week, and they weren't even concerned that I didn't go outside to grab food.
One of the rules at the motel is that I couldn't have friends or visitors. I couldn't even show my mom when she visited from the Philippines that I was safe in the room.
It feels like the city just wants to hide us from the public's view instead of actually helping us get back on our feet.
The conditions in the hotel are even worse than their policies. They said that they would take out the trash twice a week, but wouldn't come pick it up for as long as 1 month. When it rained, there would be maggots all around the parking lots. Sometimes they would come into our rooms and I would see them crawling all over the floors.
Stories like mine are not told within a vacuum. I call on anyone that is unhoused or feels like they are stuck in a hopeless situation to speak up about your experiences. You are not alone.
Everything that they said to me has not been done. Nothing from health, my mental health, dental, employment, housing. Nothing has been done. And it's been 6 months. Mayor Karen Bass, your program promised to help me. So help us.
It feels like the people that have the power to change things barely do the minimum to solve the many crises facing the city. We're here today because we can't expect anyone else to fight for us. We have to speak up and fight for ourselves.
I would like to thank the people behind me. Before I met them, I did not know that I could fight. And I forgot that I had a voice.
We're fighting for our rights. The right to be human, the right to be alive.
Join us in the Housing for Juanita campaign so that we can demand better conditions and better solutions, not only for the few, but for all.
There you go. For almost a year, we came together and took different action like mass phone calls, community presentation, and rallies. On the 8th month, we held big rally outside of our motel to expose the failure of the program, put pressure on the city to house us. And they finally did. This action proved that if we come together and fight, we will win. Now we're in a luxury studio apartment in downtown LA that costs $2,200 a month. And after 2 years, we're expected to pay that. But who can afford that? The people in power continue to manipulate the system. That's why it's important we continue to come together so we can fight as one. We're always looking for members to join our organization and work together. Let's continue to build people power, organize and fight for our right to housing. That's it. That's all I have.
Thank you, Jason. That was really great. And yeah, really important to continue, coordinating our fights and keeping up the struggle, as they sort of present us with these false or Band-Aid level solutions. So really great to hear about the work that you all are doing. And yeah, now I'll pass it back to Daniel to talk about the issue of the environment.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Jason, for that sharing. Yeah, I wanted to transition to environment, which is, also it correlates with housing as well, right? One of the biggest housing crises in the US right now is the aftermath of the hurricanes recently in the Southeast. Hurricane Helene ripped through the Southeast US. It has killed over 230 people, left millions without electricity, and really devastated poor and rural communities in Appalachia and the South, where infrastructure had already been deteriorating for decades, right? These communities completely neglected by the government. We already know this storm, this hurricane, is part of a pattern that we're seeing with climate change, and it's directly caused by the pollution and of the largest corporations in the world, the U.S. military, right? These entities that are warming the planet, and one of the impacts is that in this particular instance, in the Gulf of Mexico, the water is, especially warm. And it led to this massive storm, and even heavier rainfall, due to that warmth. And that rainfall ultimately was one of the key drivers of such devastation of the massive flooding. And so, we will continue to see these, quote unquote natural disasters, but we know that they're not just fate or circumstance, right? It is imperialism. It is the system that prioritizes profit and over the people. And so, as if one hurricane wasn't enough, Hurricane Milton, just days later, swept across Florida again, right? Even through Tampa. And the communities are sick and tired of having to deal with these catastrophes without adequate support. There was a survey that folks shared recently that said that 12% of Florida residents said that they plan to leave the state in the next year because of rising insurance costs, because it becomes so expensive to actually be, independently insuring your own home from this devastation when the protections aren't adequately met by the state, right? On both sides, you're seeing from Trump, he's demonizing FEMA and their relief efforts. He even said that FEMA doesn't have any money left because Kamala Harris spent it all on housing for illegal migrants. That's what he said, which is ridiculous. But then, the Democrats, they may be providing some aid in the aftermath of some of these catastrophes, but we know that these are also just band-aid solutions, right? The aid won't actually be enough to rebuild the communities, because the communities hadn't been rebuilt, before the storm, right? Communities in Appalachia have been lacking funding to actually, build out and like secure their homes and their communities way before this storm. So we can't really expect folks to come in and swoop in and save these areas. It will be on the people to rebuild them, right? And to build more climate resilient communities. The folks are the elite are refusing to address the root cause of climate change, right? That's ultimately one of the key issues here. By refusing to lower US military spending, right? By refusing to restrict and place the control of, these major corporations in the hands of the people to make actual democratic decisions about what happens with, the different production. So, and of course, these communities need to be made climate resilient in the first place. We all know that we can expect more devastation to come, but there's also preparation that we can do, right? But there has been a complete lack of support and preparation for these communities to be able to weather these storms. And so, this is just one example of the environmental crisis that we're seeing today. And another one I wanted to uplift is another example where folks are fighting back, right? Where taking matters into their own hands. The Bay Mills Indian community, you can see in the bottom right, has been fighting Line 5, which is an oil pipeline that is run by the company Enbridge. They've been fighting Line 5 for years now. This is a pipeline that runs right through the Great Lakes, and has already spilled over 1 million gallons of oil elsewhere across the pipeline. And folks are really worried that it could contaminate the Great Lakes, which would have catastrophic effects on the surrounding community. And it's a really interesting and critical example of the environmental crisis, because the land defenders, the water protectors, right? they have to fight against the very companies that are responsible not just for destroying the immediate environment, but the climate crisis itself, right? Enbridge is one of the major drivers of the climate crisis. Um, and so we have to continue to be aware of these struggles of Native communities, you know, and others, not just within the US and across the world, because they are really at the front lines of the environmental crisis and are also the ones providing the solutions and really fighting back. Um, so with that example, I wanted to pass it over to Jasper now to share a little bit about the issues in education that we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. So education is such an important thing for people to be able to participate in the society. You know, it should be a right that people are able to learn about the world that we all live in. But as these reactionary sentiments are being stoked to try and mobilize people to defend imperialist values and justify the existence of this violent empire that we're living in, increasingly we see that education is coming under attack. So public school systems are being banned or are being forced to ban books, change their curriculum. Teachers are being fired, all for propagating the true history and current state of the economic and political system in the US, right? Telling the true history or the true story about the history and current state of settler colonialism, of racism in this country, for standing with the people of Palestine, providing students an education on reproductive health, right? These are all things that are under attack. School districts are being increasingly underfunded. Entire schools are closing as the states are redirecting funds away from public education and towards the military budget. The schools are also understaffed. From Baltimore to Chicago, they're literally importing teachers from countries like Kenya and the Philippines to cover positions that they're struggling to fill. The government is really shifting this problem onto the students and the teachers rather than dedicating enough funding and personnel to be able to provide a quality education for our kids in the US. So this failure of the US to really provide a quality education is seen so sharply in the colleges and the universities now. This is what those graphs are. Student debt has exploded to over $1.7 trillion. That's trillion with a T. So that means millions of students are putting themselves through decades of debt payments just to pay for a college degree. So, why is the cost of higher education so high, even for public schools, right? Not just like, the fancy private schools. You can see from this graph that it's just skyrocketed. So since the 2008 economic recession, states have really slashed their budget for funding for education. And right now, more than 30 states spend less on higher education than they did back in 2008, which is crazy. That's like an average decrease of almost $1,500 per student. So basically, they're just shifting the economic burden for education from the government to the students themselves. And the government has tried to institute different kind of band-aid solutions of loan forgiveness and stuff, but they had public student loan forgiveness that was created back in 2007. Over 1 million people started the application process, but then only or under 20,000 actually ended up finishing the applications because they were so confusing, and only 55 of them were actually forgiven. I mean, the data is from a couple years ago, but if that doesn't say false solution, I don't know what does. So it's not like these schools don't have the money for it, or the government doesn't have the money for it. This education is being defunded while the government provides big banks and monopoly corporations with huge bailouts. So it's really showing that the Democrats and the Republicans have proven like neither of them actually believe that pro-people education is a right. They want it to be highly commodified or to scrap it entirely. These right-wing think tanks that wrote the Project 2025 are calling to abolish the Department of Education entirely. And we see that the Biden administration has made like some limited attempts at student debt relief, but of course this is not going to address the root cause of why tuition is so high to begin with, right? So this is driving students to borrow, trillions from these loan programs who are just making record profits off of it. But, what is even the quality of education that the students of this country are paying so much for? Under this system of imperialism, not only the economy is controlled, but even, cultural institutions and, the ideas that we're taught. This whole education system is set up to promote these ideas that uphold the dominance of the US all over the world, tell people not to question it, not to question the power of these corporate elites over the working class. So we also see that in the colleges and universities, they're training up this next line of like strategists for the US military, policymakers for the US government, engineers of deadly weapons. And, so many educational institutions have partnerships with these companies or with the military. So students are really waking up to this horrible reality that their tuition money that they're spending so much on is being invested in corporations that are killing our siblings in Palestine and other fascist regimes and US-led wars all over the world. And they're moving increasingly to take action and take control of their education. Um, they're really faced with this choice, a choice to join this system, to take out, loans and take that check when they hopefully find a job, or to stand on the side of billions of people around the world facing invasion and occupation and plunder driven by the US that they're recruiting their peers to carry out. So more and more students are educating themselves about the truth of the world, getting organized with organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine or so many other student organizations that have popped up in the last few years. And they're taking action, right? Demanding that their schools cut ties with the companies complicit in the genocide and Israel itself, pull out their endowment investments, and calling for the US government to stop arming Israel. So, and they're taking such, creative methods and actions to do so, from like sit-ins and protests to the encampments that we're all familiar with, and hopefully got a chance to help launch or support. Students are really mobilizing to end their schools' roles in war and occupation and genocide. So, just as the state sees people taking action, they're really threatened by this, right? Students disrupting the status quo. So they're going to crack down with repression. Just last week, we saw pro-Palestine students at UPenn had cops bust their doors open and hold guns in their faces just because they're opposing the system of imperialism that, these cops are serving to uphold. So, to close out, there's really a potential for an education system that is free and set up to educate people on how to actually solve society's problems, but we just have to fight for it. So, of course, that generates repression. So I'll pass it back to Daniel on this.
Thanks, Jasper. Really agitating and speaks to, really very real issues with the education system. I've definitely experienced them myself. And yeah, so agitating. And good transition into another topic we wanted to share about on safety. Right? There's a major crisis of safety in this country. The term itself, right? It's weaponized. There's all this rhetoric around like how do we create safe communities? And that is then turned into funding for police, right? What this really is, it's not a mechanism to keep people safe. It is a war, right? It is a war on working people and poor people, especially our Black and Native communities here in the US. Just last month, Missouri used the death penalty to execute Marcellus Williams, a Black man, for a crime that DNA evidence proved that he did not commit. But his story is just one example of the criminal legal system and how it operates in this country. It's not to keep people safe, it's to eliminate undesirable populations, right, and disappear them. It's now 4 years since 2020, the Black Lives Matter uprising, and police violence is still an epidemic. And running for president, our options are between Trump, who led the crackdowns on the protesters in 2020, and Harris, like a literal cop. So yeah, this is absolutely not justice. We deserve better. And the violence continues, right? this entire year, you can see on the left here, just a horrifying statistic. There have only been 10 days in the entire year so far that the police didn't kill a person in the US, right? Um, just let that sink in for a second. It's a tragedy. It's an affront to humanity, the way that police operate in this country. And of course, it's not just the police. It's the entire carceral apparatus. It's the courts. It's the prisons. It's these companies profiting off the construction of cop cities that are spreading across the country as budgets for militarism and policing continue to rise. And so, with that context, I wanted to introduce Alan with NAARPR to talk a bit about some ways that people are fighting back against this system. Alan Chavoya serves as the executive secretary for the National Alliance. He is Chicano, born and raised in Milwaukee, where he organizes with the Milwaukee Alliance to put an end to police crimes. He loves playing soccer and also a proud trade unionist. And the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression is organizing for passage of legislation to establish democratically elected civilian police accountability councils that hold police officers accountable for crimes such as assault, murder, torture, and racial profiling. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Alan. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, for that introduction. And I think it really, I'll try my best to keep this concise, but to, I think, really capture a lot of what you said of the connections that you drew of pretty much everything we've spoken about today, right? So as Daniel stated, the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, we're a national organization with branches and affiliate organizations in over 25 cities in the US, and it's rapidly growing. Our core demand really is what we call community control of the police, which would be established through these civilian police accountability councils that are democratically elected bodies that have a direct control over the police budget. They have a direct say into who polices them, how they're policed, the hiring and firing power of the police and the police chief, and pretty much all the mechanisms necessary to hold the police accountable in our communities, right? So that's a big struggle, something we constantly, are working towards. In some places, depending on the city, right? It'll vary depending on what's possible based on the legislature, based on the different obstacles the different cities and communities have to overcome in order to have something like that possible. But it is possible. It is a core demand, and that's something that we really consider necessary to putting an end to these police crimes. So to begin, really, we must ask ourselves why organize to end police crimes, right? Firstly, and I think this is probably the more immediate one, right? It's because it is an immediate need. The police within this capitalist system, they make our communities unsafe, right? We're not here just simply saying lifting lofty ideals about trying to hold the police accountable, talking about police accountability in an abstract sense. We want to put this end to police crimes because shit, you look around us, right? The police are brutalizing Black, Brown, Indigenous communities all around us. In the National Alliance, we always say, the struggle continues, but it's not just simply a struggle for a struggling's sake, right? We don't want it to continue because we just like struggling. We struggle because we want to win and we want to ensure the safety of our people, regardless of all that, propaganda that we're fed every day. We know that the police in this country don't keep our community safe. So, we have to understand the police, right, and how they function. And we must understand that the functioning of the police, it reflects the needs of the ruling class. That's simple. Under imperialism, the police will reflect and protect the interests of the imperialists, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means that they function to repress the oppressed people. They repress particularly, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor people in this country, whether they're murdering people on the streets or in their homes, right, as they've done to Sonia Massey, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, or whether they're just, assaulting our people, torturing them, or locking them up in these violent systems of, incarceration. The police under imperialism have a clear mission, and it's a clear mission of racist and political repression here domestically. So, to continue a bit, right, this struggle against police crimes, As I stated, it's linked to everything we've spoken about today, right? Economically, I honestly, if you want to get a little bit more angry, if you're not angry enough after everything that's been stated, I encourage you to look at the budgets in your city or town or whatever municipality you live in. Look at their budget. I can guarantee you, right, that about 40 to 50% of that budget will be going to policing. I live here in Milwaukee, and right now it's budget season, so everything is, they're talking about budgets, and the city's trying to pass this budget right now that increases the funding for Milwaukee Police Department by a couple million, and they're I think a little bit over 300 million at this point. And that's a shit ton of money. We're close to half of Milwaukee's money is going to the police. So not only is the police really, killing our peoples through their guns and their weapons, right? But they're starving us of the necessary resources, right? And so we can refer to this as economic warfare. It's less money for jobs, education, healthcare, safe recreational opportunities, and it's more money for policing. And this is a reflection of the national priorities too, right? With the obscene amounts of money that gets spent on the military, right? Rather than helping the people living in this country to afford groceries, housing, and relief of all these natural disasters, right? The state decides to spend more on policing, right? To repress those of us who are trying to organize around those various demands. So speaking of this repression, I think today what we're witnessing this repression against progressive movements, particularly around the question of Palestine, right? I know Sarah earlier spoke about what's at stake in Palestine and how imperialism is driving the genocide. And a lot, you've probably seen more and more pieces written about the links between how the police here are oftentimes training with the IOF and other, reactionary military forces, or they're exchanging tactics and technologies, right? So there is that material link between the police domestically and those reactionary military forces in Palestine and the Philippines and how they train together. And today we're witnessing more and more police being deployed against pro-Palestinian protesters, right? We saw and are still seeing cops deployed against the students in the encampments and protesters on the streets. And we must understand that this repression will likely increase, right, in the coming months as those struggles sharpen. So again, the police under imperialism will do what the imperialists tell them. Police crimes, they're consistent in this country, regardless of whether or not whether it's Democrats in power or Republicans in power. In fact, Biden and Democratic leaders, right, they've broken records in terms of funding for the police. And so this is why for us in the National Alliance, it was so important to be active in leading the marches on both the RNC and the DNC, and calling attention to to how it is that both parties are contributing to this ongoing war against the people through the police. So with that understanding of policing, right, we recognize that stopping and putting an end to police crimes, it won't simply come from begging politicians, right, to do the right thing or anything like that. It won't come from Democratic leaders, right, voting them into office and, thinking that they're better than the Republicans. It really will come from those of us in the streets, right? It'll come from those of us in the streets building a bigger, better movement that's capable of making community control of police possible. And we're seeing this in cities, in the work that we do in cities like Chicago and Minneapolis, where the legislative base for something like the Civilian Police Accountability Councils has been put in place or is being close to being put into place. We're seeing this in places like my city, in Milwaukee, in LA, in Jacksonville, Atlanta, where our comrades are waging progressive struggles that are stripping law enforcement of their power and putting it in the hands of the people. And we see this in cities where we have chapters and affiliate chapters and branches that are working with families who have lost loved ones to police violence and leading those campaigns to hold these killer cops accountable and to end, these torture techniques that they employ on people in jails and in prisons, and to put an end to solitary confinement, right? It was the millions of the peoples in the streets in 2020, right, that really shook this country to its core. And it will be these millions of people who will free ourselves, right, from the police crimes and mass incarceration. So, we must continue building up this organized mass movement, establishing those, key partnerships within and across movements to deal strategic blows to this decaying system of imperialism. This webinar, I think, has done a tremendous job showing how our struggles are intertwined. And if you need another reminder, right, we saw the image of Marcellus Williams, right, how even as he approached his, death at this horrendous execution by the state, we must remember how he penned that beautiful poem to Palestinian children, showing us how interconnected the struggles are, right? So again, our struggles, they really connect us, and together we can win. We're only going to win what we're organized to take. And so, we must continue building that up. So to end here, our struggle continues, la lucha continúa, but I know we have a bright future ahead of us if we continue fighting together, right? And so that's what it's going to take, and I'm sure we'll win. And I'll just close by saying all power to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was a really beautiful way to close us out. And thank you to like all our speakers and presenters. We heard from a range of different organizations who are waging their own struggles, which demonstrates the potential that people have, when they're united to adjust their conditions, to change history for the better, whether it's fighting for national liberation, for US out of the Asia Pacific, out of these different areas of the world, for better social services, for better wages, all these different measures. And, the types of false programs that are offered to us by the ruling class, like we know only exploit people. So we need to take matters into our own hands to create better and long-lasting solutions. The empty promises given to us by Kamala or Trump, or any politician who answers to the whims of multinational corporations is not going to save us. And like Nisha said earlier, when opening us up, like these politicians in the ruling class form such a small percentage of people in society. And, it's really the masses, the people who are like the most oppressed and the most exploited, who far outnumber them and, have the most power in their hands to actually change things. And, not all of the issues that were encompassed in the People's Platform were even discussed for today. We've only heard from a fraction of the different fights that are taking place across the country. And yet look at the time that we feel, like, look at the amazing work that's being done. So again, it doesn't matter if you're, someone on the front lines of war, looking your oppressors right in the eye, whether you're a student in the US, like fighting repression, or a worker organizing for better conditions. But it's really our responsibility to link up all of our struggles, to lift ourselves out of this crisis that we're being faced with, but, ultimately to end imperialism once and for all. And so our task is to really build ourselves up, build our communities up, to be ready to fight for a mass movement that can do just that, that can struggle until total victory. So, if you find yourself feeling some type of way after this webinar, really agitated by what was shared and the different campaigns like taking place, find out where these struggles are actually happening. Now that you already like have this knowledge and everything, you're prepared to go out and elevate the struggles and strengthen the resistance of people who are fighting back. Seek out the people in your communities who are facing similar problems, and organize yourselves to take action together. And if you're already in an organization, link up with local alliances like the ILPS. There are chapters in Northern and Southern California and Seattle, Northeast, Portland, and Baltimore, DMV. Again, like when people are united, we really pose, a great threat to our oppressors, and have a genuine possibility of ending imperialism, of ending the type of oppression and exploitation that keeps us down. And so the last thing we wanted to share was the ILPS's week of action that'll be launched in just a couple weeks to build the people's movement, to fight repression, war, and genocide, We recognize that the current state of affairs that we're in a really like global crisis poses a genuine threat to our ability to even, live our lives. Like we are building up to the, consolidation and outbreak of world war, and we can't passively take this. We need to come together and actually fight back, reject the imperialist false solutions that are being offered to us, and assert what it is that people actually want by linking up with each other and building a genuine people's movement. So if we'll be seeing you or your organization like out in the streets, please let us know in the chat and check out some of the different links that Nisha just sent, to figure out how to link up with us and get more involved. Yes, thank you again to all of our presenters and for all of you who stuck around. And yeah, that'll wrap up our webinar for today. Unfortunately, we ran a little bit over time, so we don't have time for Q&A, but if there are like really burning questions, maybe there's a way we can put it in like a resource document to share afterwards. But yeah, thank you again. All power to all the people. And we hope to see you all in the streets in just a couple weeks.